We don't live alone upon this earth. We are responsible for each other. And if mankind will not learn that lesson, then the time will come soon when he will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish.
As I've studied history more and more, I've noticed that J.B. Priestley was absolutely right here. Through the vessel of Inspector Goole, a man with almost enough aura to rival the wonderful and glorious nation of Albania, Priestley spells out this repeating bug in our code. That being, we can't seem to galvanise, big fancy word, ourselves into any real or meaningful action unless we've just had, or just about to have, a really bloody, big, fat, smelly war. Now, in case you didn't know, we've actually had several disagreements, all of which, whatever country you are from, was absolutely in the right about every time, and we even had 2 all-inclusive world wars. Yay! Both of these brought about rapid, lasting, and radical change, especially to the nation-sized swamp I happen to call home, Great Britain. You see, for many years, the really smart and cool people who ran our country simply couldn't be asked to do a lot in the way of directly improving things for us nasty, stupid, smelly serfs. Until a weird little gnome man from a made-up land, Wales, started messing around with the perfectly good mediocrity we Brits had enjoyed for several thousand years. Now, this wasn't technically the first time things had changed ever, but it was in fact the first time anything radical had been tried in terms of government policy in a good long while. You see, David Lloyd George thought that people with lots of money and land should probably do something about the rampant and vicious poverty, ignorance and illness that had fucked the country over since its inception. Naturally, the people with all that good stuff disagreed, and David Lloyd George essentially told them to do one, helping to pass the 1909/1910 People's Budget. This basically made the very, very well-off pay money into a new network of welfare reforms so that the stupid, smelly, ugly serfs, that's most of us by the way, didn't just crawl into the nearest gutter and die when shit got tough. Priestley's play is set in 1912 in the thick of this era of social and economic reformation. Though it's not mentioned directly, Mr. Burling, the patriarch of the wealthy Burling family, complains about the onset of a terrible disease in Britain called community, describing those pushing for a more intertwined society as cranks. This wasn't exactly uncommon at the time. The press nicknamed David Lloyd George and his cohort at the time a little-known man called Winston Churchill Holy Shit! as the terrible twins, trying to shake the country out of the odd, self-flagellating Victorian values of absolutely all ills being your fault so long as you were poor, sick, disabled, old, a child, or not classy enough. A bit like the sort of conversation you have with that one bougie aunt everyone has who can afford to shop exclusively at Waitrose and still somehow has bad teeth. Ranting aside, I'm sure you'll remember that as soon as things were looking marginally up for the people of Britain under the strange white-haired gnome minister, we ended up neck-deep in a big old war. I know this hasn't been very serious so far, but don't mistake it for a lack of respect. The war was horrific, bringing out the most vicious tendencies of our species, finding inventive new ways to burn, beat, maim and mangle each other in our own rendition of hell. But after the smoke had cleared and the guns were finally put down, the British had learnt to expect something of their government. However, weighed down with war debts and a massive empire to run, David Lloyd George's government opted for a voluntary-only assistance programme to help those who returned from the war, offering more favourable contracts to any employer willing to hire veterans, particularly the disabled. Aside from that, a massive housing effort was also launched, but has since been considered a failure. This fed into a sense of bitterness that lasted through the interwar period. From that era onwards, every party, even the Conservatives, committed to some kind of welfare system in their manifestos. The idea that ordinary people, especially those coming back from fighting in a war for us all, should be adequately rewarded for their efforts heavily influenced the 1945 election following World War II. In this election it was the Labour Party, a sort of club for smelly, ugly serfs, again, supposedly us lot, who stood out to the electorate. They campaigned on winning the peace by turning inwards and assessing the state of the country. I'm sure it wasn't that bad. After all, how bad can 6 years of war be? Oh. Labour's Clement Attlee, who was apparently a Homo sapien, though MP Hugh Dalton got it wrong and claimed it was a mouse, had to pick up the pieces left by shitloads of bombs being dropped. The government launched an ambitious housing initiative which very nearly almost succeeded if it hadn't failed. Sadly, Labour only built 1.2 million homes and knocked down a bunch of slums so that Britons were deprived of their right to live in complete and utter squalor, something now reserved for the residents of Slough. As well as this, David Lloyd George's national insurance scheme was expanded to cover all healthcare in the form of the NHS, yet another example of a Welshman, Nye Bevan, doing what the English simply couldn't be asked to do. And yet again, the electorate had come to expect something of their government. To finish by bringing the conversation back to Priestley's 1945 play, Inspector Goole represented the spirit of what the liberal governments of the opening of the 20th century wanted to bring to Britain, and even more so what Attlee's Labour wished the country could realise.
But just remember this. There are millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us with their lives and hopes and fears. Their suffering and chance of happiness all intertwined with our lives and what we think and say and do. We don't live alone upon this earth. We are responsible for each other.
And indeed, what we seem to have forgotten. Here he is lamenting a consistent failure of mankind to get anything done efficiently unless we've returned from some horrific conflict or other. Why can't we seem to escape from that? After supposedly shedding thousands of years of caveman brain savagery, why is it that we still cling to that single monstrosity? In an age of austerity, we have almost wholly tossed aside the ambitions of the so-called party of idealists that so long ago tried to will the powers that be to do better for their own. Even now, at the closing of the first year of a disappointing and sometimes rage-inducing Labour government, that old sentiment is only just waking up from its 50-year coma. Only time can tell if once again we will be bothered to take stock of ourselves and, just maybe, try to make something better. This video took a while, and it's the first of its kind that I've tried to make. I'm not an expert on any of this by any means, and this is indeed a pretty biased opinion piece, as I'm sure you can tell. But I thought I might as well attempt a simple project on social history and share it with the internet. As for what else I have planned, this summer I want my reenacting to be the centrepiece of the channel. I only upload when I think I have an idea worth pursuing, and I'd love to hear any feedback in the comments. Anyways, thanks for watching. Ta-ra.